Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to welcome everyone that is here and those in the audience on Facebook and YouTube and everywhere. Welcome to the fourth part of the series, The History of Muslims in America. Today we have Professor Rasul Miller. He's going to talk about some of the Muslim organizations of the 20th century and the influence of these different Muslim organizations. Some that we may be aware of, some that we're not aware of. So I believe you'll find very insightful and enriching history to become. I'd like to welcome Dr. Rasul Miller. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره المتراضين اللهم أرنا حق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا باطلا باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ونبيك ورسلك النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رضي الله عن أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم يا همة الشيخ احضرنا بهذا المحضر ولتعتفي بنظرة تأتينا بظفر أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله الحمد لله. Welcome everyone. As Brother Amir mentioned, my name is Brother Rasul Miller. Just finished getting my PhD up at University of Pennsylvania in History and Africana Studies. Now I'm doing a postdoc up at Yale University in New Haven. And my research is on the history of African American Orthodox Muslim communities in New York City and the surrounding areas. So I talk a little bit about folks in New Jersey and Buffalo and Philadelphia and places like that as well, but I kind of focused on New York City. And I should say that, my sort of philosophy in terms of expertise, right, is that, going to a school and getting a little piece of paper doesn't make you the expert on the subject, right? So I don't sort of feign that, this document that I wrote to get this degree is sort of the be all and end all and the last word on the history of Islam in America, or even in New York City. I do presentations. I did a presentation at a mosque not long ago, and there were people in the audience who were schooling me on stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that part of the reason why I focused on New York was sort of to make it manageable. So for instance, here in DC, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the Islamic Party of North America, an organization, a community that's incredibly important in the context of the history of Islam in America. And I don't mention them in the dissertation. Many of you all, I'm sure, but many of you all probably know more about that organization than I do, right? So we teach each other, so I'm hoping that, after, the presentation, we can exchange and we can share, and, I'm happy to try to answer any questions people have, but there might be other people in the room who can answer those questions better. And if you see me present something and you know something different than what I present, please feel free to share it, because you may be helping me correct the narrative. One of the things that got me interested in this history was that I began to read some of the works that were being published about the history of Islam in America, and it didn't match up with what the elders who lived the history were telling me, right? So that kind of set me down a path of trying to figure out, well, how do we kind of, get this story straight and preserve these other narratives that aren't making it into the literature. So that's what started me down this path. I use a lot of oral history, I should say, for my research. So I interviewed a lot of elders from various communities in and around New York City. And today, what I thought I would do as a way to kind of focus the presentation is to really center my comments on a particular community that looms large in my research and in my life, which is the community of the Islamic Mission of America, or State Street. This was a mosque founded in Brooklyn on 143 State Street. And it was founded by Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal and his wife, Mother Khadija Faisal. And I'm going to do something I don't normally do. I'm going to start by reading a section from what I wrote as a way to just kind of give some biographical background and make sure that I'm getting certain dates and locations correct. And then, we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about the community they founded, what some of their influences were, and some of the communities that influenced them that were on the scene before they started their work in New York City in the 1920s, 30s, and beyond, and some of the communities and organizations that they influenced after, right? So I'm kind of using them and their work as a window into the history of various Muslim movements and organizations in the 20th century in New York, in New Jersey, in the Northeast, and as a springboard to begin to talk about some different themes that I think sort of bring the history together. And also feel free to give me feedback on how this works, right? Reading, right? Because I don't normally like to do this, but I thought I would do it a little bit today, inshallah. Let's start here. Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal was born David Ambrose Donald on October 8th, 1891. He was born to William D. Donald and Justina St. Bernard on the island of Grenada in the British West Indies. After studying in French and English schools there, he went on to become an exceptional violinist with additional training as a vocalist and pianist. One of the folks that I interviewed, and I'll show his picture in a minute, a brother named Haj Dawood Haroun, who was Sheikh Dawood's personal secretary. He shared with me that he got the sense that Sheikh Dawood actually had perfect pitch. For anybody who knows music, this is people who are able to recognize whether or not a note is in tune perfectly just by hearing it. So he was a really accomplished musician. At the age of 21, he traveled to New York City where he obtained a scholarship to study music. He was preceded by two older brothers. One was 3 years older than him, the other was 10 years older than him. Both chose to make Harlem their home, working various jobs and renting rooms during their early years in the United States and living together for a time. By 1920, both of Sheikh Dawood or David's older brothers seemed to have been relatively well established. One worked as a longshoreman and lived with his wife and children in an apartment 1 block north of historic Strivers Row. So this was a historic neighborhood in Harlem during the age of the Harlem Renaissance, where sort of upwardly mobile black folks would move. His other brother fared similarly well, living just a few blocks away from his brother's apartment with his wife and child as well. Both had 1 or 2 lodgers, so they rented out rooms to be able to accumulate more income. One had secured a job as a railway porter. When David, who would become Sheikh Dawood, arrived on June 6th of 1913, interesting year, right? 1913, he moved in with his brother. And at some point thereafter, he also joined his brother in working for a railway company. By January of 1924, his brother had come to own an apartment building at 108 West 128th Street. 108 West 128th Street. You'll see that address cited sometimes in the literature as the address for the Islamic Propagation Society, right? Sometimes it's associated with Sheikh Dawood. Sometimes it's associated with a Sudanese Muslim who came and taught Islam in the 1920s and 30s named Sheikh Sadi Majid, right? So this actually, I was able to find, this was actually Sheikh Dawood's older brother's apartment in Harlem. So 108 West 128th Street, that same year, David, Sheikh Dawood, married a 25-year-old Afro-Caribbean vocalist from Bermuda named Clara Forbes, who had also been living in the city. David and Clara moved into David's older brother's apartment, 108 West 128th Street, and continued living there through the 1920s. David was as industrious as his older brother, and clearly something of a Renaissance man. In addition to his job at the railway, he continued his engagement with the arts. Using the apartment at 108 West 128th Street as his base, he opened up his Donald Concert Bureau, which promoted an eclectic mix of performances in the area and offered lessons in music and elocution. Clara, who seems to have been one of David's students, so she initially took lessons from her husband prior to their marriage, now joined him in providing musical instruction to patrons of the Concert Bureau. David also performed as a violinist, wrote and promoted plays, and served as a musician's manager and union leader. His work as a labor organizer provides a commonality with other black Muslim leaders of the 1920s and 30s, including Sheikh Sadi Majid, who I mentioned, and also Sufi Abdul Hamid, who some of you may be familiar with, who was a Muslim labor activist who was active in Chicago and then in Harlem. While the couple's engagement with the arts was quite lucrative, it was not the only collaborative effort they staged from the Harlem apartment. Having now adopted the religion of Islam, 108 West 128th Street also became the headquarters for David's Islamic Propagation Center of America in Harlem, which served as the primary organ for their work to promote their Muslim faith from its founding in 1928 until the late 1930s. By 1939, David and Clara had become rather active in this regard and were known throughout New York City by the Arabic names they adopted, Dawood Ahmed Faisal and Khadija Faisal. That year, Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija left Harlem for a brownstone in Brooklyn, which they converted into a mosque, the historic Islamic Mission of America, or State Street Mosque, during the 1940s. So that's just to give us a little bit of sort of historical backdrop of nuts and bolts and biographical information. So I really talk about Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija as kind of a dynamic duo. You know, there's not enough written about Sheikh Dawood, and what is written about Sheikh Dawood kind of talks about him as sort of like this lone figure. But really, when I interviewed people who were part of this community, they all made it very clear this was really a team effort, right? So Mother Khadija, that's one of the reasons why, you know, in the slide, when I initially gave this presentation, I have them, you know, next to each other, because it's not a situation where sort of Sheikh Dawood was the leader and Mother Khadija was just kind of tagging along. But she was very active in instructing young people, instructing women. One of the things, like I mentioned beforehand, that some sisters mentioned is that she took a lot of care to make sure that there were women in the community who knew how to properly prepare Muslim women's bodies for burial, things like that, and really sort of inspired a generation of Muslim women leaders, organizers, activists in her time in New York City, and that tradition really continues up until this day. But one of the things that another reason why I sort of start by describing some of this biographical information, if you read some of the literature on Sheikh Dawood, he's often imagined to be, he's often hard for people to read, right? He's hard for people to read because he doesn't fit neatly into some of the frameworks that scholars have used to sort of talk about the history of Islam in America, right? So generally the narrative has been this sort of teleological narrative, right? This narrative that says that the history of Islam in America, at least in the 20th century, sort of begins with groups like the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, right? And that folks don't really, among sort of African American or Black American or Indigenous American, whatever term you want to use, folks, those people don't really become aware of or interested in Orthodox Islam until maybe the 1960s, 1970s, when you have an influx of immigrants from the majority Muslim world. And this is something that, in my research, I found very much not to be the case, at least in places like New York City, places like Detroit, places like Newark, New Jersey, where you had these immigrant populations very early on, and you had African American Muslim folks who were aware of and interested in Orthodox Islam from a very early period. And this was the case with Sheikh Dawood, right? So some of the literature will imagine him to be a Moroccan immigrant, you know, because when he talks about having roots in Morocco and being Moorish, people kind of read that as, oh, he must have been a Moroccan immigrant because he was Sunni Muslim and he says he was connected to Morocco, right? Or he's imagined to have been a member of the Moorish Science Temple, right? Which he may have been at one time, or he may have simply been sort of willing to accept what he saw as the truth of the historical narrative of the Moorish Science Temple, even if he didn't embrace the theology, right? Some people have imagined him to maybe have roots in the Ahmadiyya movement because he used an Ahmadiyya missionary's translation of the Quran, you know, but what I found when I interviewed elders from that community, many of them said, no, we were never Ahmadiyya, but we thought this was the best translation, right? So a lot of the work I did around Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija in terms of their sort of, you know, biographical history was really sort of unpacked all that, you know, kind of clarify it and place them in their proper historical context, right? So I want to talk about three sort of important influences that really had an important impact on Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija during their early time in Harlem, right? So of course the Islamic Mission of America was founded in Brooklyn, late 30s, perhaps 1939, right? But in order to really get a sense of Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija, who they were, what kind of work they did, what their orientation was to the religion, to culture, to politics, we have to sort of back up and look at their time in Harlem, right? Prior to, you know, their move to Brooklyn. So when Sheikh Dawood first moved to Harlem, right, in the early 1900s, this was during the period of the Harlem Renaissance, right? So this would have been a time when the Garvey movement was very active, right, in Harlem, where arts and culture were very active, where you begin to have a growing awareness of Islam, right? If you look at some of the speeches of Marcus Garvey and some of his writings, he clearly is very comfortable talking about Islam, talking about Allah, talking about Islam as a religion that has a sort of natural or historical connection to people of African descent, right? It's all in his speeches, all in his books. In fact, if you look at the last page of the original edition of Marcus Garvey's Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, he sort of ends the work with a kind of challenge to white American Christians, and basically says, if you all don't start living the way you say you're supposed to live and accepting us as black people, would you rather have us go and embrace Allah, the God of Africa? And that's sort of where he ends the book, right? So this is all a part of sort of what's happening in Harlem. There's a famous, important Harlem Renaissance author named Claude McKay, who, he writes about sort of black communities in the Harlem Renaissance. He writes about communist activism and organizing and whatnot as well. He had a relationship with the Communist Party at one time in his life. But he has a book entitled Amiable with Big Teeth. Right, it's kind of a strange name. You might be able to remember. Amiable with Big Teeth. I think it's a novel that was discovered sort of later and published after his passing. But in it, he talks about the presence of East African, particularly Somalian and Ethiopian activists, right, in Harlem, right, during this period. And these were some of the people that Sheikh Dawood himself was interacting with, right? So he's in Harlem during the time of the Harlem Renaissance, and he encounters East African black Muslim immigrants, right, during his time in Harlem, particularly from Sudan and from Somalia. So I mentioned earlier a man named Sheikh Sadi Majid, right, who's an important sort of early figure, missionary from Sudan who comes, teaches Orthodox Islam. His claim to fame really is that he goes to Egypt, to Azhar, to get a fatwa against Noble Drew Ali in the Moorish Science Temple, right? But what I think is more important is if you look at his time in the United States during really the 1920s, he's spending time in places like Buffalo. He's spending time in places like Pittsburgh, these East Coast cities that you find have this very early 20th century history of sort of African American engagement with Islam. Places where groups like the Moorish Science Temple and Nation of Islam would also flourish, but where you have these early accounts of African American Sunni Muslim participation too, right? Which kind of gives you a sense of why he feels the need to go to Egypt to get this fatwa, right? Because he's working sort of in the same context, right? So Sheikh Dawood, a lot of historians, of those historians who have written about him, Patrick Bowen is one who's written kind of extensively. And there's a few others. Sheikh Dawood is often sort of posited as having some kind of relationship with Sheikh Sadi Majid. Perhaps that was his teacher. Perhaps he was one early influence. Also, the sort of burgeoning Somalian Muslim community in Harlem, right? So you have a community of Somali folks in Harlem at the time. The other sort of, early 20th century mosque that has a presence well into the 20th century is in Harlem. It's called the International Muslim Society, right? And this community, from what I've been able to gather from my research, seems to have been really born of a kind of cooperative effort between African American Muslims who had roots in the Moorish Science Temple, right? But somewhere along the line began to embrace, I guess, a more orthodox iteration, you could say, of Islam. And one of the things that you should know, that's important to know, that's not talked about often, is that the Moorish Science Temple in New Jersey, in New York, kind of very early on, you have people who are sort of embracing elements of, I guess you could say, Orthodox or normative or Sunni Islam, but still maintain this Moorish identity, right? Folks aren't saying, okay, well, I'm a Sunni Muslim now, so time to throw this Moorish stuff and all this black stuff away. That's not, their orientation, right? So you find that many of the pioneers who are recognized in some of the founding documents of different mosques in New York City, like the Islamic Cultural Center of New York, they'll mention names of early pioneers in the community with last names like El and Bey, right? And these are like Sunni, Orthodox, immigrant-led masajid, where the founders of these masajid had to sort of give it up to these black folks who clearly had some roots in the Moorish Science Temple. So this community in Harlem that starts in the late 30s, early 40s, is really sort of born of this kind of cooperative, collaborative effort between a community of Somali immigrant Muslims and African Americans with roots in the Moorish Science Temple. And these were people that Sheikh Dawood knew and had relationships with, right? Had friendships with. And so again, some of this has led people to speculate, well, was he Was he a member of the Moorish Science Temple? Was he sort of taught and mentored by, these Somali immigrants and Sudanese immigrants? And I haven't been able to find a clear answer to that question, but certainly all of this activity that's happening in the 1920s, right, 1910s and 20s is impacting him. He sort of imbibes all of it, right? And it'll help us understand better sort of the direction that he takes for his community later on. And then the last thing I'll mention as a sort of important influence on Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija is the work of a man named Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin, right? Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin. So Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin is a high-ranking leader in the Moorish Science Temple from Abbeville, South Carolina, right? Who, he may have spent some time in Newark, New Jersey, but ultimately he finds himself in Chicago, and Noble Drew Ali sends him to Detroit to be the leader of really what becomes one of the most important, if not most important, sort of chapter of the Moorish Science Temple after the headquarters in Chicago. And after spending maybe about a year in Detroit, he ultimately breaks away from the Moorish Science Temple. Again, there's evidence, it seems to be that he is interacting with Sunni Muslims who were active in Detroit at the time. There's a community of immigrant Muslims, mostly Turkish, but this mosque that they attend is one of the sort of founders of the mosque is a man named Dus Muhammad Ali, right? Dus Muhammad Ali, another Sudanese Muslim activist, organizer who works closely with Marcus Garvey. I know there's a lot of names, so I know it can be hard to kind of follow, if the names are new to you. So I try to keep some of the names to a minimum. But this community is active in Detroit. Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin sort of encounters these folks and leaves the Moorish Science Temple. Shortly thereafter, the Moorish Science Temple descends into violent uprisings. There's all these factions. Noble Drew Ali himself ends up being murdered, being assassinated. But while all of that is happening, this man, Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin, actually leaves not only Detroit. First, he leaves Detroit and he spends some time in New York City, right? Amidst of, this is during the same time when Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija are living there in Harlem, and you have this sort of burgeoning Orthodox Muslim activity. And after maybe a year or so in New York, he leaves and he spends some time abroad. First, he goes to Turkey, and ultimately he ends up spending about 5 years in Egypt, studying Islam, studying Arabic, and comes back and becomes kind of an older brother, mentor figure to all of these really important Black Muslim men in particular who go on to lead some of the pioneering Orthodox Muslim communities around the country. People like Hajj Wali Akram in Cleveland, people like Sheikh Nasruddin Ahmed down in Philadelphia, right? And people like Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal in New York City, right? So he tries to sort of organize all these folks together. And most of them, or many of them, ultimately decide to sort of develop their own independent organization or their own independent mosque, but certainly Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin becomes an important sort of influence on Sheikh Dawood and other folks of this moment. When I was speaking with Hajj Harun, I remember asking him a little bit about Sheikh Dawood's international connections and about sort of how the masjid at State Street was founded, because when you look at the literature, it becomes unclear at what point it kind of stopped being a meeting place where Sheikh Dawood would operate his cultural and music events and kind of a musalla, and became sort of a full-on masjid, right? The incorporation happens later in the 1940s, right? But it seems to be a place that people are meeting very early on. And the story he shared with me was of, and this is something that many people that I interviewed attested to, you had a strong contingent of immigrant Muslims, working class folks from South Asia, from the Arab world, particularly Yemen, and from East Africa, who worked on British ships, right? These folks worked on British ships, and many of them, when the ships would come and dock in New York, right, they would come and spend time in New York. And in some cases, they would sort of disappear into New York, right? And they become a part of these Black communities in Harlem and Brooklyn where they would be embraced. And they really served as another sort of important part of the backbone of these early Muslim communities in places like this. There's a really good book called Bengali Harlem that folks might be interested to check out, that kind of talks about the South Asian, sort of contingent amongst those folks. One of another elder that I interviewed, who was a dear friend, Imam Saeed Abdul Salam, rahmatullahi alayhi, may Allah be pleased with him. He told me a story about a friend of his whose father had been one of these folks who was a South Asian brother who worked on a British ship. And when the ship got near to the shore, he tied the Quran around his waist, jumped in the water, swam to shore, established himself in Harlem, married an African-American woman in Harlem, and just became a pillar of the community, you know. So these kind of stories are pretty prevalent, you know, pretty significant, you know, when you look at this history in Brooklyn and in Harlem, at least, these places that had the largest African-American populations in New York City. But similarly, you know, as the story goes, there was a brother, Yemeni brother, who would later become a close friend, an important close friend of Sheikh Dawood, an important part of the community. He and another, you know, sort of merchant seaman working on one of these ships. The ship docks here around Brooklyn Bridge Piers, right? The blue dot, right? And you can kind of get a sense. You see, it's a straight line from the pier to where the green dot, the location of the Islamic Mission of America, 143 State Street, and the story that was shared with me goes, the two brothers are walking, trying to find a place to pray, right? And finally they walk in front of this brownstone, and either they recognize Sheikh Dawood by the way he's dressed, or he recognizes them by the way they're dressed, and they recognize one another to be Muslim, and they start to exchange salams. And so the brothers ask Sheikh Dawood, where can we pray? Sheikh Dawood says, well, you can come here and pray in my house. And so they pray, and they're impressed with this, you know, African-American brother that let them come and pray, who's knowledgeable about Islam. And so they go back and they get back on the ship. And then the ship goes back and makes its rounds in, you know, through North Africa, right? Through around like Yemen. And word goes around in this network that when you come to New York, right? When you dock in New York, you can go find this black man down the street from the pier and you can go pray in his house, right? So ultimately, word gets back to Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi, a historic figure, prominent Islamic scholar and Sufi sheikh in Algeria, right? Who is very important for sort of the history of Islam in Europe, right? If you go to France, the Grand Mosque of Paris, right? He was the person the first imam to lead the prayer in the Grand Mosque of Paris, and his students were like instrumental. These same immigrant folks, right, from North Africa were instrumental in helping to establish that Muslim presence in Paris, right? So anyway, word gets out to him that there's this black man in America who's doing this good work and spreading Islam and giving people a place to pray. So he writes out an ijazah for Sheikh Dawood, and it gets sent through this network, right? And so as Hajarun was telling me the story, he said, yeah, I'm sitting in Sheikh Dawood's office one day, and he says to me, he said, people ask me, you know, sheikh this, sheikh that, sheikh of what? Who gave you this permission, right? Who made you a sheikh? And he takes off his kufi, right? And in the kufi he has a leather pouch, and he takes out the pouch and he shows him an ijazah from Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi, and he says, this is my permission, right? So this is the kind of global network that Sheikh Dawood was a part of, right? So, trying to navigate this phone. So, this is to give you sort of a sense of, you know, the kinds of influences that were at play in Sheikh Dawood's life in his early career. Oh, this is nice. This is taken from a newspaper clipping from the Amsterdam News in 1936, right? 1936. So this is when Sheikh Dawood is still living in Harlem, because he moves to Brooklyn in 1939. And it mentions a play called Kumba, which is moving from New York, right? From the David A. Donald Concert Bureau, Sheikh Dawood's Concert Bureau, moves from New York to Newark. So now the play is moving to Newark, right? And I have somewhere, it's City Theater in Newark, New Jersey is where the concert is moving to. In Kumba, it says, a play produced by the AF Attractions and written by David A. Donald and Dawood Kamara, right? Dawood Kamara. So Kamara is a name that gives us a sense that this person that Sheikh Dawood co-wrote the play with was probably from West Africa, was almost certainly from West Africa, possibly from Senegal, possibly from Mali, right? So as early as 1936, Sheikh Dawood is in community with this West African Muslim brother, and they're writing a play together, right? And the play is actually about Samori Touré, right? Samori Touré, the great West African Muslim, I guess we'll say empire builder or would-be empire builder, right? Who's operating and fighting in the context of the French colonization. And in one of Sheikh Dawood's writings, he actually gives us his own sort of account of his own biographical origin. He says, "My grandfather, one of Africa's great chiefs and one of the wealthiest, was a Moor, and so was my father, whose mother was an East Indian born in Mauritania. We are of the Bambara tribe, known as the Rift Night Riders, who fought the French from 1865 until 1890 with Samori Touré." Right? And so here, if you're familiar with some of the literature on people like Noble Drew Ali, and if you're at all familiar with the literature on Professor Muhammad Azzuddin, who I mentioned earlier, what you're seeing here, and we don't have time to unpack it as much as I'd like, but what we're seeing here is, what Sheikh Dawood is doing is he's taking this sort of alternative geography that people like Noble Drew Ali promote, that connect Black American folks to the history of the Moors in North Africa and Spain, right? Around the same time, you have different Black Jewish and Hebrew Israelite groups and Ethiopianist groups that are saying, you know, Black folk, our history doesn't start with transatlantic slavery, right? It starts in Ethiopia. It starts in biblical Kush. It starts in ancient Egypt, or it starts in Muslim Spain, right? Or in Morocco, right? What Sheikh Dawood is doing is he's very much sort of aware of all these narratives and entrenched in these narratives, and he's bringing that geography a little bit further south, right? He includes the Bambara tribe, right? Which is a West African tribe, right? He's saying that my folks, right, were connected to Mauritania, were of the Bambara tribe, were connected with Samori Touré. He even throws East India in there somewhere. And these are the kinds of narratives that when we read now, they make it kind of hard for us to kind of place and contextualize these sort of folks, right? You'll find sometimes when people write about someone like Noble Drew Ali, the impulse for a long time among historians was to say, okay, these guys are just lying, right? Saying that he's from Morocco. He's not from Morocco, right? But there's some better scholarship that's come out more recently. There's a woman named Judith Weisenfeld who has a really great book called A New World of Coming, where she talks a lot about Noble Drew Ali. Michael Gomez has a book called Black Crescent that came out some years ago. We talked to Noble Drew Ali, where folks are really, I think, doing a much better job of placing these kind of statements in context, right? What folks are doing is they're creating an alternative genealogy, right, that connects African American people to the world, right, to a history that's more affirming, that predates the transatlantic slave trade, right? And what you'll find as now biographers are starting to actually piece together some of these folks' life is that these facts that they're articulating aren't made up, right? They're sort of sometimes maybe mythologized, or they use certain terminology, right, that may be hard for us to wrap our head around in this current context, but that would have made sense for folks at the time. I'm going to show you another picture and give you another example that I think will hopefully make this point a little bit clearer. So this is a man named Ahmed Abdul Malik, right? Ahmed Abdul Malik was an accomplished bass player, played with Thelonious Monk, played on the famous New York City date of Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane playing. And he was really seen as he's really an innovator, a pioneer who did a lot to kind of infuse African and Arab music with jazz. Now, Ahmed Abdul Malik, during his lifetime, informed people that he was Sudanese, right? That his father was an immigrant from Sudan, right? And most people took that on face value and said, okay, he's Sudanese. That's why he knows Arabic. That's why he has that funny name, and why he's Muslim, right? But later scholars, particularly a historian by the name of Robin Kelly, have, sort of done research into his life and found that he's actually the child of Afro-Caribbean immigrants who migrated to Brooklyn, right? And when Kelly talks about him being Muslim, and Robin Kelly's an amazing historian, right? Who I personally really admire. But the presumption that he makes, that most people make when they're talking about Black Muslims in the 1940s and 50s, is that, okay, he's not in the Nation of Islam, so he's likely an Ahmadiyya Muslim, right? But when I began to interview people from Sheikh Dawood's community, they all said, no, Ahmed Abdul Malik, he went to 143 State Street. He was my best friend. He was one of the people that brought me to Islam, right? And what we find is that, and Robin Kelly does a good job of explaining this, when he begins to tell people that he's Sudanese, right, this isn't a sort of effort to kind of obscure his background and just lie and tell people he's Sudanese, right? What does it mean for African American or Afro-Caribbean man to become Muslim? And in the 1950s, at a time before Sudan even becomes a country, gains its independence, to say, I'm not a Negro, I'm not from America, I'm from Sudan, right? I'm from this geography, this polity that is synonymous with Black African Islam. That's where I'm from, right? So you want to know where I'm from? That's where I'm from, right? Similarly, when Sheikh Dawood, who promotes, at least in all of his writings that we have extant, he very much promotes Orthodox Islam, distances himself from the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple, right? But he readily admits to you, I'm a Moor, right? You know, what is the significance of that, right? And so these are the kind of things that you have to keep in mind in sort of contextualizing and grounding these early African American Orthodox Muslim communities. And so a couple of things I want to just kind of say clearly and highlight some of the things that really characterize the community that Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija built. First off, they taught Orthodox Islam. They were very vocal about that. Again, did a lot of work to sort of distance themselves or set themselves apart, distinguish themselves from the Nation of Islam. Sheikh Dawood was very critical of the Nation of Islam. He sort of developed a friendship and a partnership with a South Asian Muslim Hafiz of Quran named Hafiz Maqbool, who taught the Quran, taught lessons in the Quran in Arabic and Quranic recitation from 143 State Street. Maybe the first kind of classes offered, of that sort in New York City. In his writings, he talks about Orthodox Islam. He uses the Quran and sort of Orthodox Islamic doctrine to justify, his theological stances. But at the same time, was very comfortable sort of arguing for the importance of the empowerment and self-determination of Black communities, right? So in letters that he's writing to folks in the UN in the early 1960s, he's talking about the evils of white supremacy and how white supremacy is a disease, and he connects it to colonization and these kind of things, right? So while he embraces Islamic orthodoxy, he doesn't seem to have any kind of problem sort of standing firm on issues that are of interest to Black American folks, right? This becomes an issue later, right? Later on in the 1960s and 1970s, you begin to have rifts among Black Muslim communities in New York City and debates over how important these kind of articulations are, right? Should we be sort of embracing a kind of, universalism, right? That kind of seeks to minimize differences of race, or should we be embracing like a Black nationalist sort of political articulation? And Sheikh Dawood really is able to kind of hold both of those ideas, right? I won't even say intention. He's really sort of able to balance those things during his time in his career. Another sort of important distinction of Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's community is they build their community in this urban space, right, in Brooklyn, New York City. So prior to Sheikh Dawood, people like Professor Muhammad Azzuddin in particular really embrace this strategy of moving out to remote areas, right? Moving to rural areas and right outside of Buffalo, New York, right outside of Philadelphia and South Jersey. You have Professor Muhammad Azzuddin had several enclaves where he encouraged his followers to buy some land, to start farming, and try to use that as a way to be a sort of self-determined, self-contained Muslim community. And ultimately, and Sheikh Dawood actually tries to engage in something like this as well. He helped start a village called Medina to Salam in Fishkill, New York. But ultimately, none of these efforts are really able to stand the test of time. Some of them, they still exist, but they're not very popular. They're small. And really what you see in the case of Sheikh Dawood and others, like I mentioned, Sheikh Nasiruddin Ahmed down in Philadelphia, they're able to find success when they move to these urban spaces, right? And I think this is an important point to make, because this idea of going out into the boonies and starting these kind of rural intentional communities has kind of become popular again in our current moment, right? You may hear about, communities of Muslims saying, okay, we need to go out, live off the grid, live out of the cities, right? And these are strategies that have been tried before, right? With some success and with some challenges, right? And what we see is that Sheikh Dawood is really able to find success when he sets up shop in Brooklyn, is very much engaged with the broader society, Some accounts say that Sheikh Dawood in his lifetime may have given as many as 30,000 shahadas, right? So he's not, his philosophy is not, let's kind of have our own Muslim community that's kind of separate from the rest of the world and create this bubble and protect ourselves from the fitna and the kuffar. Very much the opposite. He's going out engaging the people, right? He's going out and giving talks to anybody who'll listen, really, you know. And people in his community are doing the same thing, right? I mentioned before we started the talk, a couple in his community, a brother by the name of Bilal Abdurrahman, another accomplished jazz musician, percussionist, and his wife, Mama Rakia Abdurrahman, who recently passed away, rahmatullahi alayha. Really a pioneer in the Muslim community in terms of, you know, women's organizing, and just really became sort of a cultural ambassador, you know, of the Muslim community. Her and her husband used to travel to West Africa and came back and informed people about the history of Islam in West Africa, the culture of Islam in West Africa, help people make that connection. They would go into the New York City public libraries and give demonstrations where Bilal Abdurrahman would show people, give the people demonstrations of African instruments, right, and give talks about African art, African history, African culture. His wife, Mama Rakia, would create outfits, right, and they would do fashion shows with the idea of, we want to show women in the community that you can look fly, you can look fashionable and still be dressed in the sunnah, still be dressed conservatively, still pull from sort of African cultural elements in the way that you dress, right? So these were the kinds of things that people from Sheikh Dawood's community were doing. So very much this emphasis on social engagement. And then the last point, and to that point, you know, we mentioned women's leadership. All of the elder sisters that I spoke from Sheikh Dawood's community were very vocal about the fact that women were a very visible, active part of life at 143 State Street. They were really some of the main people who kept the community going, and Sheikh Dawood welcomed this. The sort of best example, the most prominent example was his own wife, right? And these are all things that begin to change as we move into the 1970s and 1980s, where you begin to find communities emerge where women's leadership roles aren't as prominent, where culture and art is not celebrated in the same kind of way. We mentioned Sheikh Dawood being a musician. It's not a surprise that he attracts all of these jazz musicians. There's this very vibrant jazz community, right, in New York City. We sometimes hear about, you know, all the jazz artists who spent time in Harlem, right? But the other kind of hub of jazz in New York City was in Brooklyn, right? And it was really centered around Sheikh Dawood's community, where you have scores of jazz musicians, and these were folks who stayed local, right? A number of the folks that I interviewed, you know, were people who had the opportunity to go and tour with people like Dizzy Gillespie and John Coltrane, but decided rather to stay local. And when those artists would come to New York City, they would be the house band, right? Because these were people who had families, and their families, their sort of family life religiously, for those who were Muslim, was centered in this community of 143 State Street, right? So this emphasis on culture. Eid celebrations, right? Some of the folks that I interviewed were people who grew up in this community. They remembered fondly how their African-American Muslim parents in the 1950s would make a big deal of their Eid. You know, their mothers would sew them new clothes to wear on the Eid, and they would have these big gatherings at 143 State Street, right? And they would go to school and say, oh, we didn't come to school because it was our Eid, you know? And this is how they were able to create a culture and create a community that had the wherewithal to sustain, to the point where now you have these Muslim communities that are 3 and 4 generations deep that had roots at 143 State Street, right? And so a lot of the people I interviewed really lamented how a lot of that kind of changed, right, in the late 1960s and 1970s as other kinds of communities and other kind of influences emerged. And then the last thing I'll mention with regard to just sort of Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's own sort of religious orientation and what they taught and what they promoted is this Sufi connection, right? So I mentioned that Sheikh Dawood himself had this ijaza from this big Sufi sheikh, right, in Algeria. And some of these Somali Muslim acquaintances in Harlem that he had relationship with seem to have also been a part of this same community, right? The same Sufi tariqa, right, with roots in Morocco. And Sheikh Dawood very much sort of promoted, well, not promoted, but Sheikh Dawood welcomed folks from, you know, folks who were engaged with Tasawwuf into his masjid to come and be a part of activities. When I interviewed Sheikh Dawood's personal secretary, he mentioned, you know, that sometimes brothers from, different parts of the world, maybe from Eastern Europe or, different places that, he was kind of like surprised to see Muslims from these diverse backgrounds, where he described distinctly remembering they were with like these different types of kufis, right? Funny style hats. And they would come into Sheikh Dawood's office and they would make dhikr together and things like that. But Sheikh Dawood made the decision not to really promote this widely, right? So this was a part of his own private spirituality, and he certainly welcomed it, right? He certainly saw it as a part of the broader Muslim tradition and encouraged a handful of more learned young people in his community to sort of explore and go in that direction. But he never came out and said, hey, y'all, I'm a Sufi, right? He did the opposite. He told people, no, you should focus on the basics, right? Focus on Quran, focus on Salat, focus on wudu. And for the few that kind of he felt were ready to sort of graduate to a deeper understanding of the religion, he would sort of push them in that direction. So that's something that I thought was very interesting. We talked about Professor Muhammad Azzuddin and this older tradition of African-American Orthodox Islam, right? And also the Moorish Science Temple. If you notice, part of the reason why I keep mentioning the Moorish Science Temple and their importance is because whether Sheikh Dawood himself was a member of the Moorish Science Temple or not, it's clear that he's consuming Moorish Science Temple articulations, right? And is engaged with them, right? And the aspects of Moorish Science Temple historiography that don't seem to him to be at odds with Islamic orthodoxy, he's willing to embrace. He's willing to say, I'm a Moor. Sometimes you'll see in some of Muhammad al-Lahari's work, I notice he'll reproduce Sheikh Dawood sort of signing his name or printing his name as Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal Bey, right? So I'll even take on the name Bey, right? Perhaps this is because he was a person who came out of the Moorish Science Temple and then embraced Orthodox Islam, like Professor Muhammad Azzuddin or like some of the folks who were active in New York City. Or perhaps he was an Orthodox Muslim who just didn't have any problem saying, no, we have some commonalities there. We don't know. But either way, I think it's significant that this was sort of his stance when it comes to the Moorish Science Temple. So all of this was a part of what influenced them. And then in terms of sort of understanding the community that they built and what sort of vision of Islam they promoted, Islamic orthodoxy, very much the Sunnah. This is a time period though where people aren't really using the word Sunni the way we're using it now, right? To sort of distinguish really from being Shia, right? At the time, some of the folks that I interviewed even who were part of Sheikh Dawood's community went on to become Shia, right? And told me that, we didn't really see any kind of difference in that respect in the 1950s and early 1960s. It's really not until 1979, the revolution in the Islamic Republic of Iran, that those lines begin to get kind of drawn in the sand, right? So really what people are sort of trying to distinguish themselves against are really the Nation of Islam, right? And to a lesser extent, groups like the Ahmadiyya movement, maybe the Moorish Science Temple, but really the other group that the way I kind of tell the story in my dissertation and just in general of like sort of the emergence of Islam in early 20th century America is we can talk about the Moorish Science Temple as a starting point, right? I think that's fair, right? But once we get to sort of really 1929, you kind of have these two sort of concurrent traditions that emerge, that grow side by side, right? You have the Nation of Islam, 1930, right? You have Professor Muhammad Azzuddin, who comes back around 1934, 1935, and then this flowering of all these Black Orthodox Muslim communities, who in places like New York and Philadelphia and Detroit actually seem to have a larger presence. They seem to be more popular than the Nation of Islam in the 1940s and 50s. Then in 1954, Malcolm gets sent to Harlem and the Nation of Islam just explodes, right? And becomes this really important force in just Black urban America, all in major cities around the country, right? And that sort of becomes the most sort of popular iteration of Islam. And that influences these older African-American Sunni Muslims. The young people who are growing up in this era, they're looking at Malcolm's work, especially in New York, and they're saying, okay, we're Sunni, we're Orthodox, but we want to do that. We want to take our dawah out in the street, right? And this becomes the moment where you see the emergence of groups like the Dar al-Islam movement, later the Islamic Party, right? And so ultimately, there's a way, I think, to tell the story where we don't sort of erase either one, right? Because these are folks that are in conversation with each other, right? The conversations sometimes get, can be a little aggressive, but they're not always aggressive, One of the things that I talk about in my dissertation is you have a number of moments, a number of sort of snapshots where the Nation of Islam and Black Orthodox Muslims are cooperating in really interesting ways, right? In Harlem, right, in 1972, and this is kind of an aside, but I think it's an important one to share. 1972, you have the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, which emerges out of the Muslim Mosque Inc. So these are people who left the nation with Malcolm, people who were ostensibly at war with the nation. Their leader was, they feel, killed by the nation, right? In retaliation, the nation's mosque on 116th Street is burned down, right? But by 1972, despite all of that, there's an altercation where a member of someone basically made a fictitious call to NYPD and said, we got an officer down under siege in Mosque number 7, right? And the protocol with the Nation of Islam's Mosque number 7 is that if the police had to go to Mosque number 7, they called ahead, they came with respect. It was considered I forget the term they use, but it's sort of like hot button location, right? So you came with a certain kind of, etiquette to keep there from being an incident. The 2 police officers who had been, and this wasn't the first time that a fictitious call like that was made, but this time the call went out and was received by some officers who didn't know that protocol, right? So they run up in the Nation of Islam, guns blazing, folks in the Nation of Islam do what they were taught to do, right? And a scuffle ensues, and ultimately the NYPD has the mosque under siege, right? They've surrounded the mosque. They're in the mosque now, right? And there's a melee kind of ensuing. An angry mob of African American non-Muslims who live in Harlem surround the mosque and start throwing bricks and bottles at the police. These aren't Muslims, but they're saying, you're not going to do this to our brothers and sisters who bring benefit to our community. And this is something that I always say when I give these talks in the community, whether we're talking about Sheikh Dawood, whether we're talking about the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, whether we're talking about the Darul Islam movement, whether we're talking about the Nation of Islam. One thing they all had in common was they had this emphasis in benefiting the surrounding community, right? And this is how Islam became beloved in these urban African American centers, right? So where even people who aren't Muslim said, no, we like the Muslims, right? We'll support the Muslims, right? Even up against the police department, right? But when this happens, it's on a Friday, and it's actually Imam Saeed Abdul Salam is giving the khutbah that day at the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood. They pass him a note saying what happened. He quickly finishes up the khutbah. They make salat. They send some of the brothers to make sure the sisters and the children get home safe. Some of the brothers to make sure the businesses that the mosque own are secure. And the rest of the brothers go down to Mosque number 7, right? To make sure that those brothers and sisters who are in the nation and we Orthodox, who we've been fighting with, to make sure they're safe, right? To make sure we can stand in solidarity to make sure they're safe, make sure the community residents are safe, and try to, deal with this in a way that's, sort of the best possible outcome for all of our people involved, right? So you have these kind of snapshot moments, right? And this goes all the way back to even Sheikh Dawood's own time. Sheikh Dawood was very critical of the Nation of Islam, even so much so that one scholar that I spoke with, who knew Sheikh Dawood, he had the sense that Sheikh Dawood, who was really getting up in years and his faculties began to deteriorate in the 1970s and 80s. I don't know if that had started by the 1960s or not, but he always seemed to be a little suspicious of Malcolm when Malcolm embraced the Sunnah that last year of his life. Like, I think he might still be dabbling in this black nationalist Nation of Islam stuff, right? But yet and still, Sheikh Dawood's, the people in his community, some of them, they had relationships with Malcolm. They had relationships with people in the nation. They would meet Sheikh Dawood even, there were meetings between him and some of the leadership at the time. So there wasn't this sort of hard stance that, we don't have anything to do with you all, right? There was at least some kind of spirit of cooperation. And in the areas where folks could agree on particular agenda items, then they worked together. So I'm going to kind of, be a little quick now because I want us to get to a conversation. Like I said, the last part I'll talk about is communities they inspired. I mentioned the Darul Islam movement, right? Darul Islam movement, initially founded in 1962, goes through a series of sort of evolutions, really becomes a force around 1969, 1970, becomes the largest network of African-American Orthodox, African-American Sunni masajid, around the country. The founders of the Darul Islam movement were people who attended 143 State Street. Sheikh Dawood's masjid. When I interviewed some of those folks, some of them at least, not all of them, but some of them had a problem with the narrative that they sort of broke off from Sheikh Dawood's community they didn't feel comfortable with that sort of wording that you find in some of the literature. But they say, yeah, we attended 143 State Street. That's where we learned about Islam. That's where we got our foundation. That's where we learned Quran. That's where we learned our deen. But ultimately, I would say because of the age gap, because at this point, like I mentioned, Sheikh Dawood was born in 1891. So 1962, you do the math. He's how old? Almost 70, right? And so you can start to see how there's a natural sort of rift that's emerging, right? Where some of the folks I interviewed said, Sheikh Dawood is kind of gruff, there's a sort of class shift that's happening. Where here you got Sheikh Dawood, who's all about, sort of global unity of people of African descent. But he is a Caribbean immigrant who's able to come and become a little bit upwardly mobile. He spends all his money on helping people, right, and on the deen, but he's able to amass a little bit of wealth, right? And then you have this community of people in the 1960s looking at Malcolm, looking at urban decay and all the things that happened in that turbulent time of the 60s who are having some clashes now with Sheikh Dawood, right? And so they go off and they start their own community, which becomes the Darul Islam movement, right? And they maintain certain aspects of what Sheikh Dawood taught, right? There's this emphasis on Islamic orthodoxy. There's this emphasis on going out and engaging the community. In fact, I would argue that they actually sort of ratchet that up, and they do that on a level that even Sheikh Dawood wasn't able to do, right? Where they really focus on things like economic cooperatives, food co-ops, businesses, prison outreach programs, and things to prevent prison reentry, all of this kind of work, right? How you doing? So this is what you see happening in the Darul Islam, right? But there are also some breaks, right? The Darul Islam movement doesn't sort of continue on that same emphasis on sort of black internationalism, we might call it, right? In fact, the Dar becomes a little bit, they sort of push back on this idea of, an emphasis on, maybe racial identity or any kind of black nationalism or internationalism. They really, folks in the Dar, and the Dar is eclectic too, right? So this isn't an absolute statement, right? But folks are reading people like Maududi and Sayyid Qutb, and they're really sort of beginning to engage a different kind of sort of more political Islamic orientation, if you will. Also, you don't find the same kind of emphasis on women being sort of visibly empowered, right, as leaders in the community, in the Dar, right? And it's not something that's just unique to the Dar, right? If you study black social movements, whether it's the US organization of Ron Karenga, Maulana Karenga, or Kawaida of Amiri Baraka, right? All of these organizations are sort of wrestling with this idea, as black sort of cultural nationalism is bursting on the scene of, well, what is the role of women in the community, right? Stokely Carmichael famously, makes a terrible joke. He's asked at a rally, what's the position of black women in the movement? And maybe off camera we'll say what his answer was, right? But these kind of statements are being made, and people like Amiri Baraka and Kwame Ture, and who live long enough to evolve, later say, yeah, we were mistaken. People begin to travel to West Africa and they see, this idea of women being in positions of leadership, this is actually a very African idea, right? Malcolm himself, if you interview people who were followers of Malcolm and the Nation of Islam in the 1950s and early 1960s, you get the sense of like a very sort of hyper-masculine leader who's kind of hard on women. But then people who were talking with, who got to know him after he began to travel to West Africa and the Middle East, you see a radically different orientation to gender politics, right? He's putting women in positions of power, making brothers feel uncomfortable, So, I want to say that just to put it in proper context, because I think it's very easy to kind of descend into sort of beating up on a group like the Dar, right? As opposed to recognizing, no, this is a broader phenomenon that happens in these urban spaces at this time for, in part, a lot of political economic issues, right? You have, incarceration, mass incarceration is becoming more of an issue than it was in the 1940s and 50s. You have folks having a hard time getting jobs. You have the sort of patriarchal sort of family and community structure in America is now starting to break down because it's not really viable for black communities, right? So I just think it's important to give that context. But the Darul Islam movement, perhaps the most important, sort of organization or community that emerges out of Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's mosque, you have Masjid Farouk. Masjid Farouk. This is in Brooklyn, sort of one of the early large Arab-led masajid, right, in New York City. So one of the things that happens with Sheikh Dawood's community is a sort of community of Arab immigrant Muslims emerge around the neighborhood, right, that he builds his mosque, right, and that goes on to help sort of precipitate the emergence of an Arab immigrant Muslim enclave in Brooklyn. The Ansar Allah community of Imam Isa, all right, Imam Isa al-Hadi al-Mahdi, who went on to change his name to Dwight York. That's a whole nother conversation, dissertation, right? Just briefly, for anybody who's not familiar, his community, he ultimately ends up, he builds a community that is ostensibly an African-American Muslim community, but very eclectic. Ultimately, he sort of leaves Islam and embraces a kind of Afrocentric, first sort of Hebrew Islamic identity, and then ultimately he creates something called the Nuwaubian nation, where they're real into Egyptology, and he doesn't identify with Islam anymore, and he's now locked up on multiple counts of like child pornography and child molestation, right? And so because of all of that, oftentimes we kind of like just don't like to talk about his story, right? But he's important for a number of reasons. During the period when his community was known as the Ansar Allah community and was popular in Brooklyn, right? One of the ways that he was able to legitimize himself is to say, well, I used to attend 143 State Street too, right? And he brought Sheikh Dawood. This is an aging Sheikh Dawood who clearly isn't aware of all the sort of the scandalous rumors at this time that had not yet become sort of manifest associated with this man Imam Isa, right? He comes to Imam Isa's community. He says, okay, y'all have a thriving Muslim community. You're bringing people from Sudan to teach Quran. Okay, I co-sign this, right? And you see that in that early stage, this community, the Ansar Allah community, sort of maintains some of those characteristics of Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's community, like this sort of connection with Islam in Africa, bringing the folks from Sudan to come and teach Islam, like this sort of embrace of arts and culture, right? Whereas Sheikh Dawood's masjid becomes a hub for all of these jazz musicians, the Ansar Allah community goes on to inspire all these hip hop artists, right? From Africa Bambaataa to Jaz-O, who Jay-Z gets his start with, to De La Soul, to list goes on and on and on. MF Doom, if you know who MF Doom is, KMD, right? So there's this similar sort of recognition of the importance of art, the importance of culture, the importance of history and Africanity, right? And these are some of the things that I think make the Ansar Allah community really sort of compelling for people. And they're things that we can connect back to this, to what sort of made Sheikh Dawood's community distinct. And then, lastly, I'll mention to a lesser extent, in many ways, folks who are inspired by Malcolm, groups like the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, there are ways in which they sort of break from the brand of black nationalism that we see in the Nation of Islam, and really sort of reconnect with or manifest a sort of similar orientation to some of these issues as Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's students. Now, I'm not making the case that these are folks that Malcolm, is learning from Sheikh Dawood when he leaves the nation, or that these folks are necessarily, taking everything straight from Sheikh Dawood. But there are some really interesting corollaries between the program that Malcolm puts in place in the last 9 months or so of his life after he leaves the nation, and what Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija are doing before that time, right? One is working with the UN, right? The one picture we have of Malcolm and Sheikh Dawood together is from 1963, the year before Malcolm leaves the Nation of Islam and says we need to start working with the UN to bring, build solidarity with these other colonized countries and hold the America responsible for what they're doing to black folk. He does all that in 64. In 63, he's standing next to Sheikh Dawood at the UN, right? This sort of orientation of, Orthodox Islam mixed with a kind of black internationalism, right? We don't have time to really go into it, but that's really sort of the argument that I make in my dissertation, is that you really see a sort of predecessor of that direction in the community built by Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija. And I want to sort of end there and open it up for some questions and some conversation. A couple of things that I kind of think are like big takeaways, just to kind of reorient our minds to them. We talked about Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's emphasis on engagement with society, right? We talked about, them doing this in sort of an urban environment rather than being sort of isolationist. This is Mama Rakia right here on the left, pioneer of Sheikh Dawood's in Mother Khadija's community, who really again becomes a real cultural ambassador. There's a lot of really important work in sort of organizing in Brooklyn. She's on the board of BAM, in Africa, in Brooklyn. This is her daughter, Sister Zainab Abdurrahman, who grew up in Sheikh Dawood's community. This picture down here is an album cover of one of several albums that her husband, Sister Zainab's father, Bilal Abdurrahman, create for educating children, right? So not only is he a musician, he's an educator, and he makes these different, he makes albums actually designed for children's education, right? The role of women in the community. We talked about the importance of engagement with arts and culture. We talked about his approach to Sufism, and two things that I'll really have a hard end on. We talked about his engagement with Sufism, and we talked about his stance on internationalism, right? And these are two issues that I think we as a Muslim community in the States are still kind of wrestling with, right? And it's interesting to look at sort of the pros and cons of how Sheikh Dawood's own stance played out, right? We can look at the fact that he himself engaged in tasawwuf, right, embraced it, had a tariqah, had a relationship with the Sufi sheikh, but didn't sort of promote it, right? And we see there are people still today who kind of take that stance, right? The positive of that perhaps is that he was able to protect his community from sort of breaking apart. The Dar al-Islam movement, for instance, breaks up because the leadership embraces a Sufi sheikh from Pakistan. Some of the folks are down with it, some of them aren't, and they really kind of can't hold that together, right? It's part of the reason why that community sort of formally ends or sort of transforms into something different, right? Where Sheikh Dawood doesn't really face those kinds of issues, right? But then the flip side of that is we find plenty of people in this community who were sort of mentored by Sheikh Dawood who don't know that side of him, who later, began to embrace, different iterations of Islam, whether it be the Salafi movement or whatnot. And this isn't I'm not saying that that's good or bad, but these are things to think about, right? Him having that stance, in some ways, maybe it prevented some of his community from being able to engage that tradition, but it also maybe protected people from being exposed to certain things before they were ready, right? And then also his stance on internationalism, right? On one hand, it sort of opened up the world to him, right? It allowed him to be able to have relationships with Muslims around the world. It allowed him to be able to advocate for Muslims' rights in the States being recognized in a different kind of way. And it sort of opened up a tradition that I think we benefit from now, where you have working class black folk from urban, cities who are able to go and pick up and move their families to the Gulf and, have gainful employment there, right? People who are sending their kids to schools in Senegal, right? And Medina Bay, which is one of the places that I went to do some research, right? This sort of global sort of attitude, right? This global solidarity, I would actually argue is very much sort of at the heart of what characterizes African-American Orthodox Islam, right, throughout the 20th century. But then on the flip side, we can look at the fact that by opening his doors to so many different folks, right, by the 1960s, by 1965, where you have new immigration policies that allow an influx of folks from majority Muslim countries, now you have a huge influx of folks, particularly from Yemen, who build their community in Brooklyn, right? And ultimately end up sort of taking over Sheikh Dawood's community, to where if you go to the masjid now, you see virtually no vestige of the legacy of Black, American, and Afro-Caribbean Muslim leadership that we associate with the history of Sheikh Dawood, right? That's kind of been erased, right? And so even now, if we look at things like, a couple years ago when Trump passed this Muslim ban, right? There was a sort of presumption that, all African-American Muslims would really be against this, right? But if you talk to people in the community, I don't know if y'all had this experience, but I found African-American Muslims who were saying things like, well, I don't care about them no way because they come to America and they treat us terribly, right? These kinds of conversations, right? So, and this is what I'm saying, but I'm saying these kinds of conversations, I think, these are areas where knowing this history can kind of help to inform and guide the way we engage these kinds of issues today. So I'm going to stop there. Hope you were able to follow some of that and gain something from that.